Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Practical Theism podcast, where faith and culture collide. My name's Josh Smith. I'm your host, and today I'm joined by Chad Torgenson. And Chad is a spiritual director. He's a YouTube content creator and an author, actually. He authored the book, Waking Up Catholic, A Guide to Catholic Beliefs for Converts, Reverts, and Anyone Becoming Catholic. And he runs and curates content for the YouTube channel, Directional Faith. Chad, it is awesome to have you on the Practical Theism podcast. Welcome, man.
Hey, Josh, thanks for having me. It's great to be able to collaborate, get to spend some time talking about some of the things we have in common, and hopefully I can share some of my wisdom with your audience.
Definitely, man. So, I mean, you don't write a book about waking up Catholic without some really compelling story behind it. So I was hoping maybe to start off for our listeners who maybe aren't familiar with your work, tell us a little bit about your journey, about your faith journey, and what led you to where you are today.
Yeah, so, growing up, I had grown up in the Lutheran church, but I didn't really find faith, wasn't quote unquote born again until I was in my late teens. And I spent probably the first few years of my faith journey kind of bouncing around churches a little bit. Mm-hmm. Spent a lot of time in non-denominational churches. And that's kind of where I have this love, where I grew up in the Protestant church, kind of the more traditional Protestant church, then went to the non-denominational church. But eventually, right before I turned 30 or so, I went to a Notre Dame football game of all places. And, I was there for the football, and my brother-in-law had dragged me. But in the end, one of the things that I found there was this great community of people. And I was blown back by the idea of how the players all went to mass together before the game. And people were stopping to pray at the grotto and spend time with Mary before the game. And instead of this normal party atmosphere that you're expecting, of course, some of that was going on too, but there was this great, impact of their faith throughout the day too. And that kind of sparked my interest. And I started thinking about, well, maybe I will become Catholic. And took a little bit of time. I wasn't 100% sure that's the direction I wanted to go. It was such a stark difference. Yeah. And, when I started going through some of it, the one thing that I found was that a lot of the things I was reading were challenging. That, a lot of the Catholic books out there that I was reading were written more like textbooks. Yeah. And weren't very engaging, I guess written for the common guy like me and you. Yeah. And so as I went through that journey and started going through RCIA, and for those that don't know, RCIA is a process that you use to become Catholic. Mm-hmm. I decided to kind of document it a little bit and, think about some of the struggles that I had. What were some of the main topics that I struggled with Mary and the saints, and, why do we believe in the Pope and think that he's infallible and things like that? Yeah. And when I was all done with the process, I decided to jot it down in a book. Yeah. What
I'm kind of curious, because you went to a football game and then you were like, hey, there's something to this Catholic thing. Was it just the people that you were around? There must have been a series of events that were like catalysts to you being like, you know what? Maybe I don't really know as much about the Catholic Church as I thought I did, or something that compelled you to start researching and on that journey. Was there any event that you can recall that was like that?
I think at the time I was really looking for community. I had bounced around from a few different churches, and I was in the military prior to that. And so, throughout this time whenever you change churches in the kind of non-denominational world, you have to go church shopping. You move to a new town and you have to figure out, okay, what does this one believe? What does this one believe? Which one is closest to my beliefs? And then once you get there, are you going to connect with the people that are there? And you don't always find that sense of community. Yeah. And what I really was struck by with the Catholics that I met at Notre Dame was the fact that there were people from all over the country and even all over the world there to watch their kids playing football games, or just there because they're big Notre Dame fans. And they were speaking kind of the same language, and even going to mass, realizing that everybody, not just there, but across the world, were essentially celebrating the same mass. Maybe a little bit different homily, maybe a little bit different thing, but they're reading the same verses and the same ideas. And I guess I kind of liked that worldwide community that was represented there, and how that was kind of representative of Catholicism in general.
I love that. Well, you heard it here first. Catholics have community, because it's so funny. You hear that all the time in different Protestant circles, and people are drawn to Protestant traditions and non-Catholic faith traditions specifically. That's often cited. Oh, Catholics are too boring, or Catholics don't have community. Nobody's welcoming, right? There's all these things, but it's so cool to hear about your experience in that you saw the community, and that was something that you were yearning for in a non-Catholic church. So very cool. So you kind of went through that route. You became Catholic. You wrote a book. Where did directional faith come into play?
So it actually started with Saint Ignatius of Loyola. When I was going through the RCIA process, you have to go through that idea of, I'm going to choose a saint to be my patron saint. I didn't know much about saints at the time. And I was just kind of thumbing through books a little bit. And I came across Saint Ignatius. And I was a former military member, and I was pursuing my college degree at the same time. And those are two things that Saint Ignatius is famous for. For those that don't know, he served in the military and was injured at a battle, and that was kind of the big climax of his life. And when he did, after that, he decided that he was going to go back to school. He wasn't very well educated prior to that, so he actually spent time learning Latin and stuff like that with grade school kids as an adult.
Yeah.
And so I really kind of admired that. And so I decided to kind of stick with Ignatius. And one of the fun parts about that is that later on, when I found out about Catholic feast days, and I heard, some people celebrate their saint's feast day like it's their own birthday. I thought, that'd be kind of fun. Let me go check that out. And when I went and checked on Saint Ignatius, his feast day is my birthday. And so to me, that was just an obvious sign from God, right? That, all right, this is your guy. I need to find out more about him.
Yeah. So you eventually, your saint that you chose, Ignatius of Loyola, he's pretty well known for something called Ignatian Spirituality. And so I know that's something that you're engaged with on a pretty regular basis, and you help others engage in that style of spirituality. Tell us a little bit about that. What is Ignatian Spirituality?
I think it's easiest to actually start what it's not.
Okay.
A lot of other spiritualities are really focused on, deeper contemplative prayer, spending half an hour praying each day. Not that you don't do that in Ignatian spirituality as well, that you can't anyways. But that's not really the focus. It's not about how deep that you can get within yourself. It's more of a practical spirituality, one that you take into your life. And that's where I think, with the concept of practical theism, that's where this fits in really well, where it's more of a practical spirituality. How do you take your faith and your life and really meld them together and, make them come together? That we spend so much time, here's my daily life, and I'm going to walk through the day, do what I do. And at the end of the day, I'm going to give a little bit of time to God. And really the idea with Ignatian spirituality is, how do you give time to God throughout the day? Yeah. Not in time that you're setting aside, but in the very moment that you're in, that you're standing in line at the grocery store, you're sitting in traffic, you're at work even, that you're still giving time to God even when you're doing those things.
Yeah. It very reminiscent of what's coming to mind here. Of St. Paul when he talks about pray without ceasing. It's this perpetuating state of being in communion with God through like a continuous prayer. And I know for myself, there's times where it's like, man, I don't want to sit down. I don't want to say that prayer. I don't want to, it's like sometimes I feel like we look at prayer as this chore, and Ignatian spirituality seems to flip that on its head a little bit, from its attempt to see God in everything that's in and around you. Is that right?
Yeah, there's actually a saying called find God in all things. And that, we're always trying to find God in the big things of life. We're trying to see him in the moments of, big change or, big catastrophes in our life. We're trying to wonder, where was God in that? But we're not spending time to find God in the day-to-day things that are going on. And that's one of the things with Ignatian spirituality is that you're trying to recognize that. You're trying to see how God is moving, even in the little ways. Those little doors that he opens for you to, kind of help move things along a little bit. Or those times that he comforts you when you're frustrated. Yeah, maybe that time that you're sitting in the car and you're angry at the driver next to you. But then somehow you pull it from within yourself to say, all right, calm down, do the Christianly thing. That's God there with you and helping you, even in those little moments.
I love that. Let's dive into like a little bit more about Ignatian spirituality and give some practical meat on it. We talked about what it is, or what it's not, rather. But talking about how do you go about applying it? What's a typical day look like for somebody who's practicing Ignatian spirituality?
One of the key cornerstones of Ignatian spirituality, I think, and a great place for people to start if they want to, I guess, explore it a little bit, is with the main prayer called the Daily Examen. And with the Daily Examen, you spend time at the beginning of the day, at the end of the day, or both, where you kind of review your day a little bit. Think about, what happened that day, what went well, what didn't go well, examining your feelings and your emotions, which, for most of us guys, we want to try to avoid, it seems like, but there's a lot of really good information there in our spiritual lives where we can see God kind of gently pushing us in one direction or another. And then even finding things to be thankful for. What was something today, even as small as it may be, where God somehow impacted our lives. And by doing this little prayer, and it can only take 5 or 10 minutes when you're first getting started, but you give a little bit of time to this prayer each day. Over time, what happens is you start to recognize God in those moments with you, that you actually see him. You're, like I said, you're standing in the grocery store. Ordinarily, that's not a God moment for most people. But when you've spent time doing Ignatian spirituality and reflecting on those moments, you start to see that was a moment where God is with you. And maybe that was a good time to open up to him and tell him what you're feeling or release some frustration, that you can start to see God in your life every day.
Yeah. Are there different like layers to Ignatian spirituality? Like there might be something that's a little surface. Are there deeper layers that one can go to?
Yeah, I think so. In the end, I think it's maybe not layers. I think it's about how good you get at it. That eventually as you start off small like this, where you start to recognize God in the little ways. And then over time, you start to implement it on a grander scale where it becomes just more of daily habit, where you're just kind of walking throughout the day, feeling like God is right there with you and always having the right perspective.
Yeah. My dad is currently in the diaconate, and if I'm not mistaken, he'll totally like correct me if I'm wrong when he hears this, but I'm pretty sure he practices Ignatian spirituality, and he was describing to me one time about how it works. So I was like, yeah, I've heard of that. How does it work? What do you do? And he's like, well, and this might be a facet we could dive into, but so it's not just like the contemplative piece where it's like, okay, let's be conscious of where God might be operating, where we're finding his love, him working with us, and where the good is in the world and in our life, which is an amazing piece. But then also the scriptural piece, like the studying piece. And so he was describing it to me where it was, well, you have your scripture readings for the day, and you read a passage of scripture, and you find one thing that sticks out to you from the scripture, and then you meditate on it right then and there. And then you just sit there in quiet, contemplative meditation on that particular scripture to see what God is trying to tell you. And while you're doing that, you're being completely aware of your surroundings. So you're looking at what's happening around you and that sort of thing. Is that another aspect to it? How does, tell me a little bit about that. Because first of all, when I first heard it, I was like, that's really actually a phenomenal way to reflect on the scriptures. So it really moved me when I heard it. What about you on that end?
So most Ignatian people would refer to that as imaginative prayer. Yeah. To where Ignatius actually challenges you to see yourself in that moment. So there are times, one of Ignatius's his most famous work for sure is the spiritual exercises, which we can dive into that, where it's a 30-day retreat that you take. One of the things that comes from that is he teaches people to pray and use their imagination. So when you're thinking about the nativity, you pray and imagine that you're there. And you can actually pray whether you're Joseph standing in that scene, Mary, a bystander, maybe you're one of the shepherds. I guess you could be one of the cows too, right? Whatever you think it fits well for you. Yeah. But you actually put yourself into that scene and try to look at it from a different perspective. And it really makes it come alive. I think that you start to see scripture in a different way that, I mean, obviously if you're reading some of the Pauline letters and things like that, there's not much to really imagine. but especially when you're reading through the Gospels and parts of the Old Testament, you can really dive in and start to imagine being there and seeing and feeling what it was like. And how does it stir your heart? How does it stir your mind and your soul?
Yeah.
And that's where the difference really comes in.
I think too, I've heard it. I was doing a retreat for the Archdiocese of LA. It was like a training retreat. And one of the pieces that they had us do is they would give you a question that you were to go out, find a space, and talk to God about. And I thought it was a really powerful exercise. And this was one of my first encounters with it. The question was, what is Jesus trying to do in the church today? And I remember sitting out there. My favorite thing to do when I get in these moments is I actually started doing it when I first traveled to Europe, because I go into cathedrals and these things are so grand, and this was when I was going through kind of my reversion experience. And these things are so grand. And one of my favorite things to do is go to the very top by the altar in the first pew and lay down and look up. Right? It's just, I love doing it. It's calming, and I love being on the floor. As weird as that sounds, there's a humbling aspect about making yourself at the lowest point possible. And so I'm sitting in the back. Jesus, what are you trying to do? What are you trying to do? What are you trying to do? And then I just like, well, maybe I'll just try this thing my dad told me. I'll just start looking at what's happening around me. And I started to see, you hear nature. I'm laying on a bench actually outside, and I see trees. And I see trees, and I'm like watching the trees, and I'm just like, okay, what are you trying to tell me? I don't know. It's a tree. What's happening with it? And through this process, basically, however God was moving me, and the thoughts placed into my heart were that there's the trees, and then there was a patch that you could see through the trees to a blue sky. And it was as if he was telling me, at least this is what I took away from it, right, wrong, or indifferent. This is just what I was like, maybe he's telling me this. It was as if what Jesus is trying to do with the church is there's so much noise, which was referenced by the branches, so much noise in the church, and he's trying to show us a clear path to where he wants us, which is ultimately, in the life of grace, right? So, and that was represented by the gap that you saw through the branches to the clear, to give us clarity, right? So he's trying to get through the confusion and get us into clarity. And that was really powerful for me, because I never experienced something like that or had that in that way. And it was such a practical way to kind of step back and just let your heart move the way it needed to move, and it's pretty powerful. Have you had experiences like that, or what's been some of the most powerful experiences you've had while doing this?
Well, I think when you start to even take it to that next level, you see how with that imagination, how for you it felt very real.
Yeah.
And that's the idea. That's where it becomes very practical. Is, he teaches us these ideas because, he wants you to feel it and experience it. When you start diving into it more, when I talked about doing the examine, that's one of the things that I do I'm reimagining my day a little bit. So I see those moments in my head, and I can see God standing there, or Jesus usually standing right there with me. And especially during some of those really difficult times in life, when you really start to get down, to know that you can look back on the day, see Jesus standing there with you, it really kind of changes your perspective on it. But really, where the final step, and we'll probably talk about this more in the next episode, but when you start talking about finding God's will and doing discernment, that's where one of the benefits of this imagination comes in, because of the fact if you start looking at two different perspectives, if you're trying to discern something in life, you can imagine, okay, this is what my life is going to be like if I choose option A, or here's what my life is going to be like if I choose option B.
Yeah.
And actually taking the time to do that that's probably the most profound impact that I've had. I was once a pretty impulsive person and not good at making decisions. When I started slowing down and using some of these imagination techniques to actually say, all right, what is going to be best for my life? And seeing how it actually played out and spending time and meditating and praying on that, all of a sudden I was making decisions with a lot more clarity, where I felt like God was really leading me in a certain direction. I didn't second guess myself. And usually the results turned out pretty well.
That's incredible, man. I'm in just north of Los Angeles, and so we're in busy California, and sometimes it's tough to slow down, but it's so necessary. And this is I think such a phenomenal way to do that. Tell us a little bit about Ignatius of Loyola. Some people listening might not be aware of who he is, where he came from. What can you tell us about him?
Yeah, so Saint Ignatius, history-wise, he was born, they think about 1490, 1492. So right around the Christopher Columbus time, and his brother actually served on a ship with Christopher Columbus. So kind of gives you a perspective of when he was about. As he got older, that was kind of the height of the Reformation. So there's a lot of turmoil in the church, a lot of things going on, the Inquisition's happening. And St. Ignatius himself actually went to the Inquisition 3 times because of his teachings were that challenging to where he was pushing the boundaries of, what people thought about their faith and their connection with God and their relationship with him. And that's kind of one of the things I think that's really cool about him is the fact that, Protestants will like him because, hey, he pushed the line far enough to where even he got pulled in by the Inquisition. But at the same time, Catholics can respect it because in the end, the church said, yeah, it's good, right? But his actual story, though, he had grown up and he always wanted to become a knight. And he thought that was the thing to do. And really, that's how people at that time got fame and power and things like that, was from their military pursuits. So he really wanted to become a knight, win the girl. There was this princess he had a thing for. And he went off to battle. And unfortunately, he got hit in the leg with a cannonball. And that sent him back to recover. And really, he should have died from it. But the army that he was going against, as a French army, thought he was so brave that they actually carried him back to his home and so that he could be recovered. Yeah. Well, he spent months and months and months recovering. And he was so vain that, when his bone reset, because they broke his leg in multiple places, when his bone reset, it was deformed. And he was and they used to wear those tights at the time. He was so worried about how it would look and whether women would be attracted to him, that they had him re-break his leg multiple times and do multiple surgeries so that his leg wouldn't be crooked. Oh my gosh. And so really he was a vain man, right? That kind of sets a stage of where he's at mind frame wise. Well, while he's laying there, and he was there for, better part of a year, he didn't have anything to do. And it's not like he could pull up Netflix and start binge watching, Game of Thrones or something like that. So he had to find something to do with himself. Well, the only books they had in the house at the time were a book on the life of Christ and a book on the life of the saints. And so begrudgingly, he decided to read them anyways. And all of a sudden, to his surprise, though, he actually started really falling in love with it, started inspiring him. And especially as he'd read about the saints like Saint Francis and others that, the lives that they were living, he started seeing like, wow, they're kind of soldiers too. Instead of being soldiers of the world, they're soldiers for Christ. And that was something that started to really play in his mind a little bit. And when earlier I talked about this idea of using your imagination to make a decision between two things, it came from practical experience from him. Because as he was reading, there were times that he would imagine his life as a knight and trying to figure out, wow, is this really for me? Is this the life that I want to have? And he'd be excited for a minute, and it was, chivalrous and gallant and all this kind of stuff. And he thought this was the life to have. But then after he was done, he kind of went back to just feeling kind of blah again. But then when he started thinking about, well, what if I try to follow the saints and try to be like Saint Francis or Saint Benedict or one of these others, he would get that same sense of joy. But the difference is that joy would stay with him throughout the day. And this is where the discernment of spirits comes from. His idea of discernment, where you imagine two different things and see where God is pulling your heart. And what he realized was that, he was excited about, becoming a knight, but it didn't really give him that long-lasting peace. Whereas becoming a saint, he knew that God was pulling him in that direction because of that peace that God was giving him.
Wow. Wow. That's incredible. You mentioned something too, before we were talking about that, and it popped right back into my head. Just how God will, like, you put it out there of like, okay, I want this or this. How does it pan itself out? You make a decision, and then your actions seem to flow forward through that decision. Like you make it happen, right? And you know what I think about too? I read a lot on kind of the psychology of just human dynamics in the mind. And what's so crazy is God is the creator of the mind. Someday, maybe I'll write a book called God Invented Psychology, because I'm not a psychologist by any stretch of the imagination, but understanding human dynamics of how our brains operate and what motivates us, what doesn't. And one of the things, I'm reading a book right now called The Magic of Thinking Big, something I'm reading with my leaders at work. And a lot of it breaks down this thing, the principle of just putting big ideas and big goals out there and then committing yourself to them. And you see it, you see it in a different light from a psychological perspective, from like positive thinking and whatnot. Because it's not just like, oh, I'm always telling myself this, this, and this, and then I'm not doing it. But it breaks it down and it says, look, if you set an objective and you do the discernment, you think about it this way, you do the discernment, you set the objective out there, your mind is designed in such a way that it will problem solve you to that end, right? Which is really amazing when you think about it. So you look at all the successful people in life in all wide array of things, whether it's their marriage, whether it's business, whether it's people who seem to have it all together from their faith life, right? They've so set their mind on something, and they've been blessed with the ability to go, like, just how they were created. We're created this way to go problem solve that, versus if we constantly are doubting our identity. Like, you think about it from an identity perspective, if we're constantly saying we're not worth it, we're not loved, we're not, we have this, literally it begets itself because we're making up reasons and excuses and telling ourselves these things over and over. It becomes the narrative and the story that so like moves our life, versus when you recognize your identity as a child of God, for example, and that's the story you live by, your life necessarily falls in that pattern, right? I don't know. I was just thinking about that as you were mentioning that, because it resonates so strongly with just how I personally think God made us and made our minds and made our psychology and human behavior and how we interact with each other.
When you mentioned desire, and that's one of the things that Ignatius teaches not to be afraid of. Mm-hmm. That obviously desire can be a disordered thing. Yeah. Where if we desire the wrong things, that's bad. But God places desire in our heart for good things too. Mm-hmm. And that if you're pointed towards God in what you're desiring, well, that's a good thing. And that's something that you should pursue. And that's part of the discernment process, is figuring out, you know, am I desiring something that's going to lead me closer to God or something farther away? Yeah. And that's one of the other things that's probably big in Ignatian spirituality. They call it his first principle and foundation. Mm-hmm. And it's from the spiritual exercises, where he kind of talks about where you need to orient your life. And it seems very straightforward and very basic that you orient it towards God. Yeah. But actually putting it into practice is a difficult thing to do, to where you're not focused on what you want, but on what God wants. Mm-hmm. And the way that he teaches us to do that is through indifference, actually. So imagine that situation to where, let's say you're put in a situation where it's between two jobs. Yeah. And you said, okay, God, which one do I want? Naturally, you're going to be inclined for this one because maybe it makes more money, or maybe it's a better status, or maybe it's more the dream job that you wanted, right? But really, both jobs are good jobs. And you ask yourself, all right, so I'm going to take this to God and I'm going to discern it. Well, the first part of that discernment is to actually become indifferent and say, I don't care which one of these I get. Mm-hmm. That if you truly want to find God's will and follow the desire of where he's leading you, you have to be able to let go. You have to be able to say, even though you're inclined towards one, that you're willing to take whichever path God puts in front of you. And it makes some of that other stuff that you're talking about a little bit easier. Yeah. When you start approaching life, you know, my wife actually makes fun of me sometimes because of the fact that she says, I don't get emotional about many things. I just kind of go through life, and whatever happens, happens. Yeah. And that's kind of the attitude that you take with it. And eventually you start to see that you can find the good in whatever direction God leads you. And so some of those struggles that you have don't turn out to be a bad thing. You can eliminate them and just focus on, hey, well, where's God leading me to next?
Yeah. And it's not a laziness either. It's not a, oh, whatever happens, happens, and I'm just going to sit here idle, not doing anything. It's because I've heard of people on that side of the spectrum too. I'll, let go and let God, and then I'm just going to chill over here on the couch waiting for somebody to pay my rent. But it's being willing to walk through the doors, just being more attentive to the ones that are opening. I love that you said that, because it shed so much light into an experience I had on my own, where when I was, for those who have watched my channel, most of them know my story. I grew up Catholic, and then I went to a bunch of non-denominational churches, evangelical churches, for probably about 7 or 8 years. And then I started to notice inconsistencies between faiths. I didn't really know what to make of them at the time, but I was like, I'm just not going to dig into that. I just don't want to deal with it, right? And then I get pregnant with my wife, and I get pregnant with my son, and I'm like, I probably should figure this stuff out. And it wasn't until, and it's clear as day, this is how I tell my story. It wasn't until I literally surrendered to the reality that God, if you exist, then I'm going to uncover that truth. But equally, if you don't exist, I'm going to uncover that truth. And so I had this indifference towards religion altogether. And that was necessary for me to have in my life, so I could necessarily be open to even considering any kind of argumentation on either side of the equation. It was incredible.
Yeah, we have to get out of our own way, right? That if, a lot of times what you're talking about is you're using your mind prior to that. And if you're trying to rationally figure out if God exists by thinking about it, well, then you're going to end up thinking about flying spaghetti monsters and, the whole Richard Dawkins approach. But if you let go of that and you turn to your heart and your soul and you just become indifferent to things, that's where God can finally speak to you a little bit. And you start to recognize him talking to you, and you start to see the movement of God in your life. But as long as you're stuck up here, it's never going to happen.
Yeah, I love that. Well, this has been really, really awesome and insightful, Chad. As we wrap it up, just kind of a quick recap of the Ignatian Spirituality. I just want to ask you, what have you come to see as some of the practical benefits of this kind of spirituality, as in, why somebody should potentially consider it as they're engaging in conversation with God?
Well, I think one of the first things that, as a spiritual director, I hear from a lot of people is they're trying to find God's will for their life. I mean, that's the $1 million question that everybody wants to answer. What is God's will for my life? And when you practice Ignatian spirituality, you'll figure it out. And it ends up actually being a lot simpler than what you think. And I think we're going to cover that a little bit in the next episode. But really, one of the things that I really love about it, though, is the fact that it gives me two things. For one, I think I have a more personal relationship with God than I ever did before, to where all three persons that I think I know, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, in ways that I wouldn't have recognized before, that there's this practical approach to it. I see God in my daily life. He's not just some far off character that, intervenes once in a while. He's an active part of my life. And then the other thing is this idea of discernment, that I can feel like I'm going somewhere with my life, that there's a purpose to it, that I'm actually finding what God wants me to do, and not just aimlessly walking through life with no purpose at all.
Yeah. Well, you know what? You mentioned it. You dropped a hint. And for everybody listening, stay tuned, because we're going to have Chad, the spiritual director, back on for another episode where we're going to talk about finding God's will for your life. So stay tuned for that. Chad, this has been awesome, man. I really appreciate you taking the time, being so generous with it. Where can people find out more about you and everything you're doing?
Yeah, so if you want to check out some of the old stuff, wakingupcatholic.com is still up and running. You can find the book on Amazon. And as far as my new projects, the real focus on Ignatian spirituality, you can go to directionalfaith.com and you'll find the links there to YouTube, more information about spiritual direction. And if you really want to dive into Ignatian spirituality, I've got a whole page that describes everything for you.
Awesome. I love it. Chad, you're awesome. Thanks so much for joining us, man. Appreciate you.
Thanks a lot. See you in the next one.
Awesome. For everybody listening, wherever you might be listening at, definitely hit that like button. Give that subscribe button a nice little jab, a little pound, if you will. Ring that bell so you can continue to get more of this awesome content. And if you're listening to us on iTunes or any podcast platform, wherever you might be listening at, throw a review down below. We'd love to hear from you, see how you're enjoying it. It helps the algorithms, gets us in front of even more people. And if you're on YouTube, join the conversation down below in the comments. It always goes down in the comments. So we look forward to hearing from you and seeing you guys next time. From all of us here at Practical Theism, we'll talk to you soon.